My favorite thing when I was a child was Pokemon. I was obsessed with not just the game, but the entire franchise. I memorized the Pokerap, watched the anime whenever it was on, prodded my mom to buy cards at the gas station when she went in to get cigarettes. I owned the Pokemon movie soundtrack on CD-ROM, and I still have the bonus case that came with it. My most prized possession, which I kept hidden under my mattress, was one of those golden plaques of Jigglypuff you could only get from Burger King. And of course, I played Pokemon on my Game Boy every day. You may recall from my Neon White video that getting Pokemon Silver was a watershed moment for me, as it created my most salient memories from my first trip to Europe. Yeah, I know, I was a pretty lame girl, but one who fully bought into Pokemania. I was a loyal devotee of Pokemon from ages 5 through 15, through the Ruby Sapphire generation to be more specific. In middle school, I was the most fanatical Pokefan I knew, and I facilitated many other people's relationship with the games, as I carried a mess of link cables in my backpack, allowing my classmates to trade Pokemon with each other or battle whenever they wanted. What may surprise you then is how little I care about Pokemon today. I never played Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, Black, White, Sun, Moon, Sword, or Shield, and bought but only had a fleeting interest in X and Y. Earlier this year, I didn't particularly enjoy Arceus either. In a month, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet will come out, but despite having the coolest names of any game in the series, I pretty much don't care. So, what happened? Why did my love for Pokemon die? For the longest time, I blamed Pokemon. Already by Ruby and Sapphire, it felt like they were more Pokemon than I knew what to do with, and many of the Pocket Monsters' designs didn't inspire me like they had when I was 5. I just wasn't excited to catch them all if them all was Pokemon who I felt were uninteresting. Meanwhile, from my perspective, the anime grew stagnant. Ash's journey seemed perpetually stuck in neutral. But perhaps the biggest culprit was Pokemon's game design. I felt that I had already done everything Pokemon had to offer, and with each new iteration I was just running on a treadmill, doing the same old thing again and again. But that's just what I told myself to avoid a more somber truth. I changed. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl were released in September of 2006, the month I began high school. Suddenly surrounded by older kids, some of them verging on adulthood, I was changing. I made friends with people who didn't care about video games, and certainly not Pokemon. I started listening to music, like really listening to music for the first time in my life. I even started picking up instruments to play. While I had a girlfriend in middle school, I was still a child at the time. I kid you not, I replied to her request to go out by quoting a Pokemon.
Why not?
God, I feel really bad for that. If you're watching, I'm so sorry, Nicole. Anyway, things had changed. I could feel my heart flutter when I talked to girls I liked, and I lied awake at night wondering if they liked me back. Some of them did. I was changing, becoming in part who I am today. So, in hindsight, it's obvious. It's not that Pokemon changed, I did. That's what this video is about. Change. I'm changing, you're changing. Some of those changes are big and some are small, but everyone changes nonetheless. Yet, when I hear people talk about their favorite video game franchises, saying things like, Final Fantasy used to be great and now it sucks, or look how they massacred Sonic, the idea that maybe they've changed doesn't seem to enter into the equation. The focus is usually reserved for the games themselves, but I've got news for you. The margin of difference between Halo Combat Evolved and Halo Infinite is actually quite small. The same goes for pretty much every video game series. You may be able to find exceptions, and maybe that one video game series you used to really like did screw the pooch. But take a step back and honestly ask, maybe it's me. I can think of a lot of ways I've changed and how me changing affects how and why I play games. So, in this video, we're going to explore how people's relationship with games changes using vestiges of our pasts. Since I'm just one person, I only have so many personal anecdotes about games I've played. So, to aid me on this journey, I've enlisted the support of other video essayists. Honestly, they're the stars of the show. Together, we'll tell you the story of how your favorite game series didn't change. You did. A common theme among people I talked to on the topic of change was the divide between youth and maturity. As children, we're often wrapped up in figuring out who we are, but as adults, we're far more sure-footed. One of the biggest changes in adulthood is freedom. Freedom to do what you want with who you want. As Afterthoughts explains, that freedom can sometimes usurp the virtual freedom video games provide.
As a kid, I played a lot of Legend of Zelda and World of Warcraft. Not to fight fantastical demon crime, but for the simple pleasure of seeing what's over there. As a 10-year-old with no disposable income, no car, and a curfew, this was a pretty welcome sense of empowerment. Now that I'm older, I have my own King of Red Lions. I have a lot of new ways to see what's over there. And a lot of new over there's to go see. So I don't get that same feeling of empowerment from World of Warcraft or Legend of Zelda. And not just because I have played those games into the dirt. There's not a lot of new territory for me to explore. I've been there. At first, losing that feeling made me sad. I could really only process it as losing something, not gaining something new. Now that I spend so much time on the road, games fulfill a very different need in my life. A social need. There's nothing better than hopping into a game of Heroes of the Storm or Jackbox and spending some time with my friends across the country, or across the world. Wherever we are, we can get together. Throughout my life, the games that I've been drawn to have been ones that fill a gap, something that I'm missing. Which kind of makes me wonder, what sort of games am I going to be playing in another 10 years?
It isn't just freedom we gain from adulthood. We're also able to choose who we're with and what to do with them. The increase in responsibility and relationships changes how we view and spend our limited time, as LambHoot explains.
A series I've maintained an interest in across various iterations of myself is Resident Evil. When I recall who I was when I discovered it, I find it hard to relate to that version of myself anymore. I was a young teenager, too junior to go to work and too old to go to camp, being raised by a single mother and stuck alone at home for most of the summer. Finding Resi 4 tucked away in my stepbrother's stuff while he was gone for the season with his bio family was a godsend. It gave me something to do. It turned an otherwise uneventful couple of summers whose main events consisted otherwise of chores, yard work, chatting on MSN about and two girls I had crushes on, and binging Judge Judy every day at noon with a couple of microwave pizza pockets, into some of my most cherished summer memories. Waiting till my mom left for work, shutting the blinds, setting the living room dark, and just going through the game over and over again. Christ, I must have beaten it over 100 times. Resi 4 was one of few games I owned, but it was so good I didn't need anything else. It was eerie and campy and more cinematic than anything I'd ever seen before, to the point that it inspired me to learn how to edit video and start making cutscene reenactments on this little site called YouTube. It was a goofy hobby that reeked of over-obsession and having nothing better to do, but it kept me busy and creative under my imposed summertime restraints. Today, the thought of replaying Resi 4's campaign makes me want to vomit. I'm fucking tired of that game, or rather, what it takes to play it. I don't want to close the blinds, I don't need to spend all summer alone at home, I don't live in an environment that I don't like anymore. And while the VR version is an incredible achievement, and I'm sure I would have loved it as a teenager, it feels silly to even further isolate myself while my partner spends the evening alone in the adjacent room. Today, if I'm going to play a Resi, you bet it's going to be 5, 6, or our favorite, Resident Evil Revelations 2, a game that, like me, my girlfriend, and maybe 3 QA testers at Capcom have ever played. Resident Evil evolving into an explosive, turn-your-brain-off zombie action dum-dum game offended me as a teenager. I saw the addition of a karate kick button as the death of a series I had just discovered, and that plugged neatly into my lifestyle, that of an angsty, lonely teenager who needed something to do during the summer while the rest of his friends were off on vacation with their families. But today, as a person with a full-time job that isn't games-related, those same qualities that ended my respect for it as a kid are what make playing the series' later entries an accessible, chill group activity. As someone who now thinks a lot more about the media they consume and create, the series' fluid commitment to any and all genres it's ever claimed to be a part of gives me a lot to reason and talk about these days. It still inspires me, but now to do a lot more than just throw on a bomber jacket from Bass Pro and sync up some audio from a cutscene. And maybe it's just me, but as someone who was regretfully on my own a lot growing up, I find it easy to feel guilty idly playing games alone when someone I care about is nearby and we could instead be spending our time together. What I appreciate about the Resi games that everyone else seems to hate, cough cough 5, 6 and the Revelations, is that they don't force you to choose between playing a dumb game and doing something dumb with someone else.
In LambHoot and Afterthoughts stories, we saw how the different pace of life people have as adults changes how we relate to a game series or genre we loved. Paradoxically though, sometimes our relationship with a game changes specifically because the game doesn't. Like a passing sign on the freeway, how they look depends on where we're looking from. Games are often fixed in place. We're just passing by. Darkfry explains how potent that feeling can be.
Hello, it's me, Darkfry, Spirit of Vengeance, and I want to tell you about a little tradition I have. I replay Persona 3 every single year during the summer. Yes, I really do this. I played it for the first time when I was just 11 years old, and have since replayed it more than 10 times. I don't know how much I understood of the game when I was 11, but I loved it. Even my child brain could see that this is a mature game with mature themes. And that is how Persona 3 was etched into my little brain. Every time I played it again, I was a year older, and every time I would learn something new and get a new perspective. But my impression of Persona 3 as a mature game would never change. I always thought of the cast of Persona 3 as these serious adults, but they're not. They're all in high school. There was a moment during my annual playthrough 3 years ago where I realized that I was now older than every character in the main cast, and I was instantly reduced to ash. Everything my child self knew about Persona 3 got shattered. The game didn't change. I did. It made me realize how much I grew since my first playthrough. It's fitting that the game that did that for me has a calendar system that reminds you of the constant flow of time. Incrementally through the years, my perception of the Persona 3 cast went from badass superpowered adults to kids with the weight of death and the apocalypse on their shoulders, and it made me appreciate Persona 3 so much more. I did not replay Persona 3 11 times. 11 different Darkfrys played Persona 3 once.
Just because a game or series is fixed doesn't mean we can't find new ways to enjoy old things. A change in perspective distances us from why we initially enjoyed a game, but can also reveal fresh qualities we hadn't considered before, as Harry from VideoGamesAreBad describes.
I'm 5 years old and we're at a car boot sale. The price of me tagging along with my parents is that I get to buy my very own video game. Any game I want, no strings attached, providing it's under £1. After various perusals and haggles, I was the proud owner of a copy of Age of Empires 2. That's right, nothing too obscure or cursed, I'm afraid, despite the dubious setting. I played it as soon as I got home and fell in love. I was the ruler of my own town, the king of the castle. I would play with high disregard for the strategy part of the real-time strategy and build colossal cities backed with regimented armies. I would clear through each of the campaigns, usually with a liberal use of cheats when it got too difficult. When that wasn't enough, I would open the map editor and make my own scenarios that I'm sure were much cooler in my head than they were in reality. Years later, a third entry in the series. Despite it being considered the odd one out by the community, I loved it even more. I mean, there were guns, come on! I was a little bit older by then, I was actually, playing the game. I took the campaigns a bit more seriously and even dipped my toes into the murky waters of online play, consistently getting my butt handed to me. For years, almost every day when I came home from school, Age of Empires 3 would be my game of choice. And then, nothing. For a long time. Aside from a half-hearted at launch re-release of Age of Empires 2, the series was radio silent. Then, everything happened. A remaster of the original Age of Empires, then the next year a remaster of Age of Empires 2, then the year after that a remaster of Age of Empires 3, the game that I love so much, and beyond that, a new game, a fourth entry, Age of Empires 4. I'd argue one of the unicorns of video games. It's here, it exists, you can play it right now, and... Okay, first of all, I think Age of Empires 4 is brilliant. It was one of my favourite games of last year, and while the competition isn't exactly stiff, it's probably the best RTS since StarCraft 2. But that's not the point, obviously. The point is, I'm not 5 years old anymore. I'm not the kid that builds sprawling fictional cities anymore. Age of Empires 3 came out in 2007, Age of Empires 4, 2021. It's been 14 years. A lot has changed since then. And look, I don't want to spell doom and gloom here and lament the loss of my childhood or anything like that. I'm enjoying Age of Empires 4, just not necessarily in the same way. I'm playing it as a competitive game, finally taking some overdue wins online, looking at build orders and guides from professional players and reveling in the excitement of casted games. Don't get me wrong, I'm not taking it ultra seriously, I only hop on occasionally and I still lose more than I win, but it does make me wonder. In another 14 years, will I look back on this game just as fondly as I do on the castles that I built in my childhood?
Sometimes our relationship with a game series simply runs its course. Perhaps it was never meant to last forever. For instance, I know Golden Sun games after the first exist, but while I adored the original, by the time I finished it, I was in the twilight of my love for that style of Japanese role-playing game. To me, it wouldn't matter if a new Golden Sun game came out tomorrow, because it would either break too far from the series' traditions and alienate me as a result, or it would just be another version of the Golden Sun I knew and loved, in which case, I have no need for it. pimscrypt has some similar feelings about their relationship with an old favorite.
The funny thing is that I feel like my breakup with what used to be my favorite video game series was kind of a unanimous decision. The tagline for Halo 3 was, famously, "Finish the fight," which is as final as a tagline can possibly get, and I did finish the fight. More than once, on harder difficulty levels and with friends. I did play the follow-up Halo 3 ODST, I played some of Halo Reach at a friend's house, and when Halo 4 came around, it put a final Promethean-sized nail in the franchise's coffin. Or rather, it made me realize that the nail had actually already been hit back in 2007. That's when the fight was finished. That's when I finished it. Replaying these games today, while I occasionally find the joy I felt back in the day, feels like I'm trying to make things work with an ex that I haven't dated for 10 years. It doesn't matter that these games are good, great, or even perfect. They're not a part of me anymore. I learned to live without them for years. I don't miss them anymore. Letting go of something, finishing the fight, is scary as hell, but when we look back, it just feels natural. It feels okay. I mean, who has the energy to fight forever anyway?
Perhaps the most obvious way people sour on a game series is because their tastes change. Maybe when you were 14, you loved horror games, but in the intervening years, they have failed to retain your interest. So when you go back to play Five Nights at Freddy's, it just doesn't hit you as hard as it used to. Perhaps the biggest shift in my personal tastes between when I was young and now is how much less patience I have for turn-based games. For most of my youth, you couldn't catch me without my nose in my Game Boy Advance or Nintendo DS playing RPGs like Pokemon, Breath of Fire, and Final Fantasy, or a strategy game like Advance Wars, Fire Emblem, or Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. For a while, I thought I grew tired of RPGs because they got too complex for my smooth brain, not just mechanically but narratively. A game like Final Fantasy X with 6 hours of cutscenes stretched how much I wanted a story to unfold during gameplay sessions. In actuality though, RPGs have always been heavy with dialogue to read. What happened was my tastes changed. I wanted to play action games, buoyed by the online fun of Halo 2 and Gears of War and mechanical frenzy of Guitar Hero or Wii Sports. I wanted the joy of pressing a button, or swinging a Wiimote, and feeling the consequence of that action, which a turn-based game just couldn't give me. Even today, I grow bored with turn-based RPGs. I'm actually kind of embarrassed by it because it makes me feel shallow. But it's foolish to think our tastes are right or wrong, especially considering you're going to wake up one day and they'll be different than they are now. Skyehoppers and Chariot Rider give us great examples of such change in their stories.
This is the copy of Mario & Luigi Dream Team I bought in 2013. A few years later, it was one of the few games I brought with me to college, and it has stayed with me ever since. This cartridge has been on the shelf of every dorm room and apartment I have lived in, from Oregon to New Mexico to Amsterdam and back, and now, finally, to Oregon again. I have never played Mario & Luigi Dream Team beyond the tutorial. For, oh god, almost a decade, I have been meaning to play this game. Just haven't gotten to it yet. This is a bit of a personal embarrassment of mine. But how come? Dream Team is not considered a must-play game by most people. As it turns out, bouncing off the tutorial is a pretty common experience. But see, I'm a fan of the Mario & Luigi games. Or at least that's how I have long thought of myself. I feel that I have somehow let the series down, that I owe it more loyalty because of how much it taught me. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time playing games, but I didn't play a lot of different games. Most of my experiences were short bursts that had to be returned to Blockbuster before even getting to the meat of the game. Does anyone remember Blockbuster? That was a joke. But this meant that for my parents to commit to the full price tag of a game, they had to know that I would be satisfied for hours on end, which for them boiled down to recognizing the word Mario or Pokemon in the title. Eventually, I received a game that captivated me like none before it. I knew how to platform from Mario, I knew RPG mechanics from Pokemon. In Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, I could do both at the same time, combining elements from different games into something that both wears its inspiration on its sleeve and feels like something entirely new was delicious to me for reasons I didn't understand. That video games could mix and match like this was a revelation. I played Superstar Saga and its two sequels countless times across my childhood. In 2013, Dream Team's announcement had me ecstatic, but by the time it released, my understanding of video games had shifted further yet. I had learned, finally, just how far beyond Nintendo and Sony the medium went. Games could be independent. Suddenly, everywhere I looked, there were games iterating on and combining old ideas into something fresh. This whole time, I had been playing only on the tip of the iceberg. What I found so unique about Mario & Luigi was everywhere. Of course games can mix and match influences. They're art. Maybe I'll play Dream Team one day, maybe I won't. The Mario & Luigi games were fun and innovative to be sure, but their meaningfulness to me has been far surpassed by other experiences in recent years. I have left the series on the shelf, but my taste in the games I play instead was shaped by them regardless. The ancestry of my fervently held belief that video games are a powerful medium of artistic expression can be traced to Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. I may never play a game from this series again, but I carry them with me still.
When I was a kid, I was obsessed with space. I read every space-related book I could get my hands on. I gave school presentations about the planets, and I thought that black holes were about the most insane thing in the universe. Personally, I blame Boy Scouts for introducing me to stargazing. Late at night, far from the city's light pollution, the sky couldn't look more majestic. Aside from being obsessed with actual space, I also loved space games. In particular, Kerbal Space Program. Unlike most games, which simplify the act of getting into space, Kerbal Space Program players have to think like NASA scientists, with multi-stage rockets, solid and liquid fuel, and carefully planned burn maneuvers. For a kid obsessed with space, the thought of a game that roughly approximated the experience of real-life space exploration was really cool. Kerbal Space Program really makes me appreciate the incomprehensible scale of even our own solar system, and how insane it is that scientists have actually landed things on these distant planets. As much as I loved Kerbal Space Program, I didn't exactly have a way of playing it. When I was 15, I got an older MacBook. While it was great for stuff like Mount and Blade and Spelunky, it didn't run Kerbal Space Program very well. My main way of interacting with the game was actually watching Scott Manley play. His wealth of knowledge made his Kerbal Space Program videos really interesting, because he not only had the logistical expertise to do insane things like landing on Eve, but he gave great commentary contextualizing what he was doing. Over the years, I watched all 106 episodes of his Interstellar Quest series, which saw him playing Kerbal Space Program's campaign mode with the ultimate goal of creating an interstellar rocket. As I got older, my interests expanded. Eventually, I replaced my old laptop with a desktop computer that gave me access to the wide world of PC gaming, an ecosystem I quite enjoy. On the PC, there are so many strange but compelling games to choose from. Eventually, I did end up playing Kerbal Space Program. Finally, I had access to the world's most intricate rocketry simulator ever created, but I didn't play it all that much. It's not like I didn't enjoy my time with it, but such an open-ended sandbox requires a lot of time and attention, and with my ever-growing backlog of games, the thought of spending dozens of hours in Kerbal Space Program felt a bit exhausting. I wasn't a rocketry expert, and while I could certainly learn, instead I found myself prioritizing other gaming experiences. I still have an immense amount of respect for Kerbal Space Program. Even years after its release, no game has replicated its commitment to deeply simulating the challenges of actual space exploration. And because of that, Kerbal Space Program remains unique in how it depicts space. In Kerbal Space Program, space is vast, mostly empty and harsh. But the humans, or Kerbals, who meet that void are ingenuitive, resourceful, and despite the odds, can claw their way out of their home planet into the vast beyond. There is no game quite like it, and I will never not respect it for that. No matter how much I change, Kerbal Space Program will have a seat at my cognitive table, along with the ever-diversifying list of games that have transformed my life.
On occasion, the way we relate to and understand the world changes so drastically, we can't just go back and enjoy something we used to. When I was a kid, I loved Mortal Kombat. I enjoyed the carnage of the games, their pixelated blood, the absolute brutality of their violence. Moreover, my dad had both movies on VHS, and they were some of my favorites to replay on the TV and watch with him. Lately though, whenever I see footage from contemporary Mortal Kombat games, I wince. I guess sometime in the past 25 years, I got squeamish. I don't want my video game violence to be that visceral. It makes me just a tad uncomfortable to watch, even though I know it's mostly a big joke and shouldn't be taken that seriously. Aranock experienced something similar with one of her favorite game series from eons ago.
Far Cry 3 and Borderlands 2 were some of my favorite games when I was much younger. I played through both of them multiple times. Far Cry 3 drew me in with a very different style of open world game from what I had played in the past. Its ludonarrative consonance between the main character's change in view of the world, reflecting the mechanical advancement of leveling up and the increasing knowledge I had as a player of how to approach its encounters. He becomes of the world of violence throughout the game. There was a time, and some of you may not remember this, where the towers and outposts system was a novel concept in open worlds. Far Cry 3 was so good that its design would be run into the ground over the next decade by Ubisoft and their copycats. Every idea Far Cry 3 had became somewhat dull and overdone. It is, in a way, a victim of its own success. I still think it's enjoyable to play, but its sense of mystery and novelty has been dulled by a decade of playing its derivatives. Nothing about it changed, but my ludological knowledge has. Those changed feelings, unfortunately, don't end at my view of its gameplay loops, but also its narrative. We'll get to that in a second. Borderlands 2 is a game I was extremely excited about, pretty much exclusively off of its aesthetics and the ads. Its gameplay mostly holds up, and it's got some excellent moments in its story that still emotionally land really well for me. My brother and I bought it on release, and I played it a lot. I can probably still repeat large sections of the game's dialogue verbatim in time with it, but I wouldn't want to. Far Cry 3's most famous repeated motif is derivations on this quote from Einstein: "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results." The game explores this concept on many levels, the repeating patterns of its gameplay becoming a part of this thematic thread. There are parallel repeating elements between the story of Voss, a primary antagonist, who says that phrase the most, and the main character. The villains repeatedly kill or believe they have killed the main character in story moments, which is then reflected by dying in gameplay, but not really dying, instead repeating. However, it is also about how these repetitions inevitably end. Your character cannot die no matter how many times the enemies kill you, until you get to the predestined end of the story and fulfill your fate. This repetition motif is thus intertwined with fate and inevitability. While I still find the thematic cohesion of the game interesting, there is an issue with how it's presented. Some of you have probably guessed where I'm going with this. If you did, well, that makes us two peas in a pod. Two bullets in a mag. Two cannibal... Yeah, as I said, I don't think I want to repeat the quotes from Borderlands 2. That game was offensive to many when it was released, and it hasn't gotten better over a decade of social change that occurred since. It was a lot easier for me to ignore many of its issues when I was 13 and had less than great views and a lot of self-hatred. A decade later, as a mentally ill disabled person who understands those aspects of my identity, it's rather uncomfortable to go back to Borderlands 2 and to see its cartoonish misrepresentations of mental health and physical disability, and its less than great humor about similar topics. In text, it's explicitly a game about murdering a large number of mentally ill people because their mental illness makes them evil. Now, to be clear, most of the characters are presented as mentally ill in some way. You can even play through as Krieg, and I have to say my playthrough with him was an experience, to say the least. Krieg is a playable psycho, who is a plural system with the good logical headmate and wee crazy murder headmate trope, an old played out rather gross caricature of plurality. The game's writers clearly approach a lot of mental health topics with the basic assumption that mental illness is a joke to the audience at baseline. A good amount of the humor is just pointing at something and going, freak, weird, isn't that funny? Isn't it quirky? Laugh at the differences. Voss is a particularly good example of what I refer to as Hollywood crazy, a ridiculous caricature of mental illness that, all the while, presents mentally ill people as violent and dangerous. It constantly interconnects mental illness and violence, even implying that the player character's increasing violence comes from losing their mind. The message is unfortunately and unavoidably ableist in nature. So is much of Borderlands 2. Jack's villainous actions are treated as only occurring because of having his mind fractured at the end of the pre-sequel. Both games uncritically regurgitate harmful tropes and concepts about certain marginalized groups that are well trodden in media. Every Far Cry I have played since 3 has tried to recapture what they did with Voss's popularity, dipping into stigmatizing mental illness each time. Borderlands 3 slapped alternate words over its enemy types, but the underlying messaging and discussions have not fundamentally changed. It has the same type of humor as 2, and while Borderlands as a series has great representation for certain groups, I find it hard to celebrate that while also being confronted by these other aspects. It's not that Borderlands 3 is necessarily vastly worse or different, it's that I changed.
Ultimately, you are the collective result of your experiences. Every time you play a game, read a book, watch a YouTube video, they are added to an ever-increasing pile of media you've consumed. And the bitter truth is this: you can't go back and experience them again. I can't play Pokemon as a 5-year-old girl ever again. That's an experience I had, one which shaped who I am, but specifically because I had it, I can't have it anymore. The center of life and your relationship to media is the unique intersection of where you're at and whatever meets you while you're there. You can't step in the same river twice, and you can't experience a game as the person you were then ever again, because the very act of playing your favorite game changed you forever. Don't be sad though. The relationship that was may have slipped through your fingers like sand, but its remnants live on in you. And that beautiful feeling is far more valuable than any attempt to experience it again could ever be. iamerror, asking you to go sub to all the wonderful people who contributed to this video. Links in the description. Signing off.